primary control with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking, episode 110. The title of this episode is The Shock of the Old. This is again an exceptional conversation. For a long time, I looked forward to speaking with Professor David Edgerton. He is currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg to Berlin and Hans Rausing Professor of the History of Science and Technology at King's College, London. He is a noted historian of the United Kingdom, as well as historian of technology and science. In the latter field, he is best known for the book Shock of the Old from 2007, which has been translated into many languages. He is also known in the UK for his commentaries on political and historical matters in the press. He is also a fellow of the British Academy. I read this book some years ago and it left quite an impression on me. We talk about technology, or rather, why the word should not be used, about progress and stagnation, what role technology plays in societal change, and if we really live in an age with an unseen pace of innovation, and much more. For all new listeners, this podcast is usually in German, but with a growing number of great English episodes. On the podcast website, you can use the tag filter to select episodes by language. Furthermore, this podcast is free of advertising, but as I'm sure you enjoy these conversations, please do me a favor and recommend this episode or the podcast as a whole to your friends, colleagues, or on social media. Now, without further ado, to the conversation with Professor David Edgerton. David, thank you very much for joining me in this conversation.
My pleasure.
I read your book, The Shock of the Old, some years ago, and it really impressed me. And before we go into some details, I would like to ask you a question. How did you actually come up with the title, The Shock of the Old?
Well, very late in the day, actually. The book was initially called The Uses of Things.
The Uses of Things.
The Uses of Things, which I rather liked.
Oh.
But my publisher at a very late stage said, that won't do at all. That will confuse people. So please go away and think of another title. And I was sitting in a pub with a couple of friends telling them that I was rather annoyed at having to change the title when it suddenly came into my head, The Shock of the Old, the contrast to a famous book by an Australian art critic called The Shock of the New. And I have to say that I think the title of the book was fundamental to such success as it's had. And it also, in many ways, summed up the argument rather better than the uses of things. So I'm very grateful to my publisher in retrospect for his late intervention in this story.
Sometimes the title changes of publishers make a positive impact.
Absolutely.
Not always, though.
no, perhaps not always. But it is a prerogative of publishers, and I'm delighted that in this case it worked out so well.
We're going to come to, let's say, the core of your argument maybe a bit later, but I would like to start with a maybe more fundamental question. You talk a lot about inventions, innovations, technologies in your book, and I was struggling a bit with the term technology, because in English you have the word technology. In German, interesting, we have two words. We have Technik and Technologie, which I think Technik is a bit more the concrete one, and Technologie in German is more like the broader understanding. But what does technology mean in English? And by the way, I don't know if you know the book from Kevin Kelly, if you know Kevin Kelly, and he used the term technium, I think. And I think the term technium from Kevin Kelly is probably more technology in German. I don't know. Can you maybe give us your idea how you see these terms?
Yes, well, technology is a very problematic concept. And if I were writing The Shock of the Old again, I would not use the term. In fact, in every book since Shock of the Old, I have avoided the use of the word technology, except as an actor's category. And that is, in fact, very liberating. If one talks about motor cars or trains or airplanes or agricultural techniques, one is being more concrete, obviously, but also one is evoking a much richer understanding. I mean, technology is a concept which I think macerates the brain. Why? Well, because it conflates two things, machines, structures, processes, with theories about machine structures and processes. That's to say, to take the German language, technology and technique become one thing, one conflated thing.
Exactly. Hardly anyone really uses them distinctly, do they?
No.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in English, technology means both those things, and in fact, some strange conflation. Even worse than that is that technology has come to mean not all technique, but just some technique. The technique that is fashionable at that particular moment. So technology or tech now means something digital.
Oh, by the way, sorry, because you said it, I don't exactly know who said it, but some author made the point, like a bit jokingly, of course, he said, technology is what comes into existence after you're born.
Yes.
In the sense, because and I discussed this recently with students, because like, for instance, for me, the smartphone, I was not born with a smartphone. Yeah. So smartphone is technology for me. But if you're maybe 15 today and your whole life is with these technologies, I think technology then more becomes something like the background, like the normality of life, no? Something like that.
Well, technology is a novelty. So it's associated with novelty.
Yeah.
And not all novelty, just some selected novelties. So it is a very, very elusive and dangerous concept, because at one minute you're talking about a very specific thing, your iPhone, and the next moment you're talking about the material constitution of the world. So it's intellectually hopeless. It's as a concept. Why did I use it? Well, because people talk about technology. I wanted to engage with people who wanted to think about technology. So when it came to the second edition, I kept it, but reluctantly. As I say, if I were to write the book again, I would not use the term technology.
You use another related term in the book, if I remember correctly, the term Creole technology.
Yes.
How is that related to what you said now?
No particular relation. I use the term Creole actually in a very particular sense. I mean, there is a standard United States use of Creole, which is quite important. It refers to a language. In America, it usually refers to something like a hybrid language, or in the case of cooking, it refers to specific mix of like French and something else. It's a fusion cooking in the south of the United States. So it tends to connote hybridity, fusion. But the original meaning of the term is quite different. It comes from Spanish, criollo. A criollo or Creole is somebody of, say, Spanish descent or African descent, born in the New World. It carries the idea of transplantation into a new place, and it often carries the sense of authenticity, of down-to-earthness, as opposed to more sophisticated metropolitan outlook. So I wanted to use it to say that techniques are used a long way away from their place of origin, and are often, or sometimes, used in new ways, or more extensive ways than in their place of origin. So it was just a way at getting at the movement of technique and the modification of technique, as it were, over distance and over time.
That's interesting. I think we might come back to that again. But you mentioned something else before. You talked about novelty, and this, of course, brings me to one of my pet themes, so to speak, namely the question of progress in the sense of what happened over the last, let's say, 50 years or so. And you have a quotation in your book. You say or I think you quote someone else actually, information technology was everywhere except in the productivity data. So this just is one aspect of the topic, and I listened a lot to the late David Graeber, and also people like Peter Thiel, Eric Weinstein, a lot of people actually brought the idea, which I generally feel is correct, that we saw quite a significant stagnation in the last 40 years, especially when you consider how much more effort we put into science and technology, because there is the British physicist, now the name escapes me, a cosmologist, maybe it comes to me again. He was on a video podcast, and you saw his office, and in his office room there was the photo from the Solvay conference from 1912 and 1914, one of those. You know, this photo with the 30 physicists with Lisa Meitner was not there, Einstein and all of these people. And then he said, look, this was world physics in 1914 or something. And they created everything from thermodynamics to relativity and what have you. And today we have hundreds of thousands of physicists. And what exactly is the progress? So how would you see this term or this topic?
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, there are lots and lots of cliches, and this is what economist Robert Solow is getting at in this quotation. People are talking about radical transformations, ever accelerating rates of change, ever accelerating rates of innovation. But where's the beef? And indeed, you're quite right to say that in the rich world, productivity growth has stagnated over the last 40 years. Wage levels for the working class have stagnated over the last 40 plus years in some cases, like the United States. Rates of transformation of the economy have also been lower than they were in the past in these places. So it's not self-evidently the case that the rate of transformation has gone up. And indeed, a number of people have myself included, have pointed to the extraordinary rate of change around, let's say, 1900. And that in many ways one can see the 20th century, even the late 20th century, as the playing out of the developments from that era, electricity, cinema, and motor car, and so on and so forth. And that then leads to the thought that you've enunciated, that we are spending much more on innovation today than in 1900, many times more. But the outputs, as it were, have not been commensurate with that change. I think that's very important. The declining productivity of research and development. For example, in pharmaceuticals, where it's most easily measured, I guess, is indeed a feature of our age.
May I play one idea with you, because I just wrote about this in the book I'm just finishing, and just to make this idea clearer to the audience, I tried to take three people who lived at different times. The first was Charles Darwin, who is like born at the beginning of the 19th century and lived until, I think, 1880 or something to that respect. The second one is like a German biologist who was born in 1890 and lived until 1980, so he was 90. The third person would be me, because I was born in the 70s and, okay, I'm still alive. And then when you just compare how their life was affected by the technology and the changes of the time, I found this very interesting, just to making it more concrete. Because when you think of Charles Darwin's life, he lived at a time of unbelievable technological and scientific discoveries, from steam engine to the trains in England to motor. He had an extraordinary things happened. But when you look at the life of people of the time, so the practical daily life of Darwin as a child and as an old man, was not very different. So he maybe used the train, but the ordinary people didn't use trains, because the ordinary people, trains were not for ordinary people at the time, to my understanding. But then when you take someone like Frisch, who was born a little bit before the 19th century, so pretty much lived in pre-modern times when he was a child, and then he had everything from mobility, cars, atomic bombs, moon landing, computers, everything until the 1980s. And in my life, when I look around, okay, things got smaller, cheaper, displays got thinner, stuff like that. But if I would have beamed myself as a 10-year-old to the day, I would not be surprised about the world, right? But if someone who was born in 1890 would have beamed into 1970 or 1960, he would be shocked what changed, right?
Yes, I think that's broadly right. And if you look at living standards, when was the moment in which living standards accelerated? That period, certainly in Germany and elsewhere, would be 1945 to the 1970s. So yes, I think what you say is correct. And if what one is just thinking about the kind of wow factor of new innovations, I think it's difficult for us to claim that we have ever been astonished in the way that somebody coming across electric light for the first time, or the cinema for the first time, or the motor car for the first time was astonished. After all, most of the things that we...
Or running water in your apartment.
Yes. Well, then there's a whole issue then about things. What are the things that are most important in terms of people's lives? But the level of astonishment is not the same as how people's lives are affected. So one could argue that some of our modern innovations are spectacular. And indeed, in some cases, we have a huge amount of expenditure on innovation, but also important results. And the famous case of that, I suppose, is Moore's law, the increasing capacity of electronic processors. But of course, that's just one element.
Yes.
Even of an iPhone or a computer or a computer system. It shouldn't stand for the whole, much less should it stand for technical innovation as a whole.
It just comes to mind, there was a German professor, he unfortunately died relatively young. He was writing about complexity essentially, but he just brought in one of his talks, like the picture that I liked very much of a crab basket, like a basket where they put crabs in, right? And he said, like, a lot what we do in our society is like the crab basket. There's a lot of movement, but nothing is happening, because in the end, the crabs are all in the basket in the end. It's just a lot of commotion, but not a lot going on.
Yeah. And it's also very important to remember that technical change is just one element in change. There is too much of a tendency when one is talking about this strange thing, technology, to assume that technological change is the driver of all change. Yeah,
but that's pretty much an idea I think that many technologists would have. Like Kevin Kelly, I would think, would have the opinion that the major driving force in society is technology. You would not agree with that?
No, I mean, it is a very common idea. I don't think it has much substance to it. Obviously, technical change is hugely important and has impact, but it's not the only source of change. And I think it's very, very important to remember that.
But there's another point that you mentioned before already. Kevin Kelly has it in his book, and you have it in your book too. The question is, does technology disappear? What about life cycle of technologies? Because I think many people have intuition that, something new comes and something old disappears. But that doesn't seem to be so simple, right?
No, and we can make things disappear. We can make certain emissions disappear, but it takes a lot of effort. And if you ask the question, what things have gone out of use over time? Exactly. It is hard actually to find examples where things have gone completely out of use. Of course, the extent of use might well fall, and indeed fall dramatically, but complete disappearance is rather rare. One of the examples I have in mind, I don't think this exists in Germany, but in the United Kingdom, in the houses of rich people in the 19th century, just outside there was a bit of metal to scrape your boot on before you went into the house. We had this in an old house. You have it in our house?
Yes. In my old house we had it, but it was removed at one point in time.
Yeah. I mean, no modern house has something like that. That is, in a sense, a disappearing technique or disappearing object. But there are still houses that have them. It's still there. But more importantly than those sort of rather exotic cases are the cases of old things that have grown in importance. And this is a central part of the argument of shock of the old, that our innovation-focused accounts of history assume wrongly that the old disappears and the new replaces it. For example, in the case of energy, and here I'm drawing on a brilliant new book by Jean-Baptiste Frézos called More and More and More, so history of energy. We assume that we are now in an energy transition.
We are not.
And we have been in the past in different energy transitions. In fact, the production of coal is still increasing. So we are living in the great age of coal. The production of oil is still increasing. The production of gas is still increasing. And Frézos, furthermore, points out that our consumption of wood is still increasing. So there's never been an energy transition. What we have instead is a superimposition of new techniques over old ones, and indeed the transformation of the old techniques as well. So I think the idea that the old disappears and the new comes in, and therefore the new is what is determining the shape of our societies, if one believes these technological determinist theses, is fundamentally flawed.
This brings me to two, I believe, very important thoughts or aspects. The first is the one you already explained, but I think it's so important to stress it again. Many people tend to believe that there's radical transformation, radical technology, and then like a snip, more or less within a few years, things change. But whatever technology I research, shows that there's decades and decades. Just yesterday, because I researched it, like Haber-Bosch, for instance, the ammoniac synthesis, right? When you see ammoniac was extraordinarily important substance, right? Even at the beginning of the 20th century. And Fritz Haber made it in the lab in 1908 or something like that. And then about 5 years later, very fast, Carl Bosch managed to make the first BASF production site. Fine. But then when you look at the global production of ammonium, or ammonia, you call it.
Ammonia, yes.
Yeah, ammonia. In German, it's ammoniac. Anyway, you see that it's practically flat until the 1950s. So even though the technology was there, and then in the 1950s it starts to rise, and then really it rises in the 1960s. So my point being, whatever technology you look at, right, it takes decades and decades to scale and to grow until it really gets the impact, right?
Yes, in the standard case, I think that's right. And computers, when you date the first computer to, it could be the 19th century, electronic computers to the 1930s, to the 1940s. Numerical control of machine tools, you could date first experiments to the 1940s. I mean, these are very, very old techniques, but also changing techniques. So your point about Haber-Bosch is very powerful, but of course Haber-Bosch doesn't stay quite the same. The catalyst changes, the size of the plant increases very radically from a few tons to 1,000 tons or thousands of tons and so on.
And all sorts of gradual improvements that we don't see so easy from. I just saw it like, I don't know the exact numbers, but something like to the effect, the first nuclear power plants in the 50s, 60s had like, they were running for 80% of the year or something. The remaining 20, something to that effect, not exactly. The remaining 20, 25% were maintenance and replacement. And today, nuclear power plants run 95. So this is a huge difference in terms of efficiency and of the system. The same obviously happened in the industrial processes.
Yes. No, exactly. So concretely, if we are talking about the material constitution of our world today, we have to be thinking about coal mines, about coal power stations, about ammonia production using Haber-Bosch process, about the making of motor cars with machine tools and assembling them on assembly lines. All things that we would, in our naive, not to say wrong-headed account of technology, we would place sometime between the 18th century and the early 20th century. But this is our world today. We need to understand that.
Exactly. Václav Smil is very powerful to that extent, and I always recommend it to students. Anyway, but there's a second aspect to what we're talking about, and something, so if you want change, if you want progress, let's put it like this, how many activists and so on tend to do, then there's always this sense of urgency and like, we need a revolution, we need to change everything. And my gut feeling is that this is a very wrong-headed idea, because revolutions typically lead to destruction of things you don't understand. I mean, let me just give you a quotation from John Gray from his book Black Mass, which I like very much. And he writes, the world in which we find ourselves at the start of the new millennium is littered with the debris of utopian projects. So what is your opinion of revolution or evolution if you want change?
Well, I think it's very interesting that we use the term revolution when talking about technology. It's one of the fascinating things about the world that these technologies are supposed to bring about is that really nothing changes, except perhaps the technology itself. The world that is being promised is actually a very familiar world. Technological revolutions have been promising us world peace and more wealth, more leisure for 150 years. They're not promising revolution, they're promising the same thing. What's important is that often those things don't come about. I think that's how we should think about technological revolutions. There's another sense in which the notion of revolution is important in technology. It's a way actually of avoiding change.
Revolution, they're talking about revolution as a means to avoid change. Okay, you have to explain
exactly that sounds deeply paradoxical.
Sounds paradoxical,
doesn't it? But it's actually a commonplace. So, for example, in the case of climate change, we are invited to look forward to a technological revolution that will allow us to get rid of coal or oil or whatever it might be. What is the effect of that? The effect of that is to say we don't need to do anything now. Yeah? we can just rely on the fact that there will be a revolution in the future that will solve our problems. I think you can't understand the politics of climate change if you don't understand that that argument has been made again and again since the 1970s, precisely as a way of avoiding change.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is, and I would say the question is, how do you achieve, or how do you go for change?
Yeah.
Because the flip side of that is, which I find equally devastating, is when you claim to be able to do something that we just, I think 20 minutes before said is not possible, namely, oh, we have everything, we just have to do it. Mm-hmm. Like what people with the German Energiewende claimed. No, you have no freaking clue how to do it. Mm-hmm. You have some windmills and some solar cells, and you believe you can switch the energy. You have no clue how this works in scaling. No clue. So the point is, you promise something, and no, we figured out, and you know what I mean? When you overpromise, then you can also waste extraordinary amounts of money into solutions that simply don't work. Whereas an evolutionary approach might be much more beneficial for everyone.
Yes.
Does this make sense?
Yes. But you need to be careful in dismissing those arguments. I think it is the case that with the techniques that we have, that we use even, we could change the world dramatically. That's to say, the limit to change is not the techniques that we have. We are not exploiting every possible technique that we could be exploiting that we already have. Take the case of climate change. One of the major users or generators of CO2 is transportation, and within that, private cars. We could very easily say that we would limit the size of engines to a litre and a half. We still have very powerful cars, but we will be reducing the level of CO2 being emitted. In other words, our capacity to reduce CO2 from transportation is not limited by our technical knowledge of the internal combustion engine or whatever. So there is a massive capacity for transformation in the world. Another example would be around food. People make this point routinely. If we were to reduce our consumption of meat, we would be able to reduce emissions of CO2 from agriculture very radically.
There are always complexities behind that are not so easily seen on first glance. But anyway, this is what.
No, of course, that's right. But what I'm saying is that even if we stopped all innovation now, we could still change our world. Right.
Okay, from that point of view, So your point is more like not necessarily technology is not necessarily needed for change.
Exactly.
In any case,
in the case of reducing CO2 emissions. Now, that would be a silly thing to do because we could also gain an advantage from further innovation. But relying only on innovation is a recipe actually for inaction. In fact, it's often a deliberate ploy to ensure that there is no action in the present.
That is actually a very interesting thought because you also see this in corporations where always the newest, shiniest stuff has to be. I remember, I cannot say names, but I remember a large company and they had deep problems on a very fundamental levels with technology. And the technicians were over years struggling to get the attention of the board members with fundamental stuff that will come in a moment, maintenance namely, because maintenance, I think, is a very underestimated topic. But let's pause it for a second. But then at one point in time, this was the time when blockchain and that stuff was the hype of the day. The board members came, guys, we have to do something with blockchain. And people said, what we are struggling and now we should do something that is entirely irrelevant for us. And then, of course, people worked for weeks to find something that you could do with blockchain. Everyone said, okay, this is nonsense, but if they wanted, we can do it. You know what I mean? This is absurd, no?
And that's very common. And in the United Kingdom at the moment, the argument is being made that artificial intelligence is the answer to the problems of the National Health Service, which is in crisis. It obviously isn't. but nobody ever lost money by claiming that artificial intelligence or blockchain or whatever is the future.
So it can be a smokescreen in a way to...
Absolutely. Yeah.
There was a second thing you said before that I found very fascinating about promises, because you said like something about promising world peace or something. When I researched a little bit history of invention, this is one thing that you stumble over and over again. The one example I bring my students is, I forgot the name. There was an American investor who built the first transatlantic cable. It must have been in the 1850s, I think, something around the time, if I'm not wrong. Okay, but the interesting part was, what was his elevator pitch, so to speak, when he tried to bring investors on board. And one of his arguments was that this would end war, because the idea was war comes to play because of misunderstandings, and the faster communication would eliminate the misunderstandings, and so we wouldn't have war anymore, right? I don't know if he really believed it, but at least it was an argument that he made. Or think of Alfred Nobel, who thought like his explosives are so terrible that no country would make wars anymore, because, and then the internet again, the same thing, peace technology.
Exactly. The same, right? The radio is the same, television is the same,
yeah.
The atomic bomb is the same. Absolutely, yeah. It's a very, very tired rhetoric, but curiously, the people who use it think they are being original. So people who said the atomic bomb would bring world peace thought that this powerful thought kind of arose from the power of the nuclear bomb itself. They couldn't admit, actually, that it was a standard cliche.
Although with the atomic bomb, I have to say, I think that the story here is a bit more interesting in the sense of a risk profile, if you will. Because one thing is true, there was no Third World War since the atomic bomb, because insofar it was correct that countries who had atomic bombs did not fight. They might have fought, how do you say, replacement, how do you say, like when...
Proxy
wars, yes. But they didn't fight insofar that's correct. But, and this is also what makes me so angry, honestly, about like books from Stephen Pink and so on, when he makes the argument, we are living the most peaceful time ever and so on, and then he makes some graphs that interestingly begin at the time when there is peace and leave the 100 years before out, and then comes the First World War, Second World War, and then there's quote unquote peace. But what is completely misleading, in my opinion, in this argument is that we reduced, Nassim Taleb would call it, we reduced volatility, so we have less smaller casualties, that's the wrong word, less smaller conflicts, rather. But if we would have a big conflict, it would be completely destructive.
Yes.
So like the risk completely switched because this wasn't existing in 1930.
Yes.
Now if this would come into play, it would be pretty much game over.
Yes, no, indeed. Well, it has to be said that the first arguments about atomic bombs and peace refer to atomic bombs rather than hydrogen bombs, and atomic bombs were nowhere near as powerful.
Yeah,
but your point is correct. I mean, and of course things change and weapons change, and the effects of the weapons change over time as well. But the rhetoric is unaware of this. I mean, it is the same old story being repeated, and that is just one example. I mean, it's most of the commentary on this strange concept of technology is profoundly unoriginal, but assumes that the new technology that has been talked about will have original effects. But this is only possible. It's only possible to believe this if one is in ignorance of the discussions around technology from the past. Because the reality is that most arguments about technology are deeply unoriginal and wrong, this has to be said.
Which brings me to another point that I find extraordinarily important and entirely underreported. If I understand you correctly, please correct me if I understand you wrongly. But we are living in a world that's actually full with quote unquote old technology, or a mixture of old and new, to be more precise. And we're totally dependent on that, on technology from the 19th century and what have you, bridges and so on. So one of the most important topics is actually maintenance. And maintenance is rarely ever, it seems to be the most boring topic on the planet. But at the same time, it seems to be one of the most important ones. And also I recently talked with a student and we talked about software maintenance, because I like to bring the example, because in software and IT, people always blink, yeah, things change every 3 days. And also students, of course, in computer science believe that. And then I'm telling the story. I worked at an insurance company, and I was managing director of the software department. And one of the people who worked there who was close to retirement, he was close to his 60s, he was in his 60s. And he once told me at the cafe or something, he said, I would have never thought that code that I wrote when I was 20 as a student in this company would still run when I go to retirement. So software he wrote 40 years ago was literally in the same way running 40 years later. So maintenance is massively important. And especially, in my opinion, what is not seen is that you can only innovate when you maintain before.
Yes, absolutely. Maintenance is once one thinks about it, obviously central to the world of production, the world of transportation, the world of buildings. It's obviously central to the life of engineers. Professional engineers are much more likely to be engaged in maintenance than in innovation. And yet, when we look at what's written about engineering or about things, maintenance is hardly ever mentioned. I'm pleased to say, a chapter on maintenance in Shock of the Old. And researching that, I was really astonishing to find how little information, statistical or otherwise, there was on this obviously central topic. As we're speaking, we're in a building put up in beginning of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this building has been maintained regularly. The road outside has been here since that time. It is doubtless been remade many times over. We are near a train line that has, I'm sure, been there from the late 19th century, but it had to be remodeled again and again. So the maintenance of existing infrastructures, existing techniques, existing machines is absolutely fundamental to our lives.
As you mentioned that, it brings me to another thought that I find very disturbing, honestly, because you mentioned this building here. And is it not interesting that, at least in Vienna it's like that most people, if they have the choice, if you would ask people to choose freely, most of them would want to live in an old building. Maybe if you build your own house, but let's say you have to choose an apartment in a city. Hardly anyone would voluntarily, if money is not the issue here, right? So most people would like to live in an Altbau, like an old 19th century, properly maintained. Why? Because I think the living quality is much better. But there is a more fundamental point I want to make. We see so many buildings from that time that we still refurbish, that we still repurpose, and that are working perfectly fine. But I see loads of buildings. I also have friends who are architects and engineers, and you see new buildings that are made with the quote-unquote new technology, and that collapse after 20 years. I even have the idea, people tell me, not to be officially quoted, that buildings today have a lifetime sometimes of 20, 30 years, and then they're like throwaway. So clearly that's not progress, is it?
No, well, no. Although, I mean, it could be in that you might want to live in a world where you can remodel your buildings radically every so often. But I think you're right. I mean, people do in many parts of the world. I mean, it may not be true of the United States, let's say.
I'm talking mostly about Europe.
Yes, if you have the possibility of buying a beautiful apartment in central Vienna, you are indeed very lucky. Now, part of the reason that we want to do that is that we tend to preserve the better quality buildings of that time.
That's true. That's one
isn't, maybe. Yes, one isn't going to buy a hovel that our ancestors lived in. I mean, we'd want to buy a building like this one with wonderfully tall ceilings, big rooms, a classic haute bourgeois villa that was expensively built in the first place. But yes, we live in a material world that has been built up over decades, centuries, and we need to recognize that if we are to change things in the way that we might wish.
Now I would like to change topic to, I think, another point that impressed me a lot when I read your book, and I thought, let's see if I understood it correctly, okay? And I thought a lot about this, namely the question, where does knowledge come from, roughly spoken? And this interestingly overlapped with something I read recently from Thomas Sowell, Intellectuals and Society. And he asks the question, where is knowledge in society? And from I bring his point. First, his point is like, we have the misguided assumption that like the intelligentsia, like the professors and the academia, they sort of represent knowledge of society. But if I interpret him correctly, then this is a big misunderstanding, because we have certainly some knowledge there, but we have a vast amount of people who have a lot of, you might call it tacit knowledge, or you might call it whatever you might call it, practical knowledge, like how to maintain a bridge, how to fix a particular machine or what have you, that no professor knows, right? And I think my gut feeling is you make a similar argument that we focus too much on, or have too much the idea that you even see it in funding programs. You make fundamental research, then we make applied research, then we make like a spin-off company. Everything comes from science, and then it goes to, but I guess that's not your understanding, right?
Well, no, you're right. Everything today has to come from university, and the university knowledge has to reflect kind of all of society. I mean, in the 19th century, no one would have believed that one, thought that was a ridiculous idea. Universities were places where you studied theology, where you studied ancient languages, where you studied mathematics and possibly natural sciences, well, and certainly medicine as well. The idea that you would be studying the nature of the economy, or how a factory worked,
or how to make railways.
Or how to make railways. It would be an absurdity.
Isambard Kingdom Brunel was not an academic.
Because, of course, there was a huge world of knowledge outside the university. It was obvious. Universities are very special places concerned with very special kinds of knowledge. But today we want to conflate. And you're absolutely right that amongst academics especially, there is a belief that all knowledge has come from the university, and in particular from natural science in universities. And that's simply wrong. There are whole areas of innovation that owe very little to universities. Photography, for example, didn't come out of university. Brewing didn't come out of a university. Steam engines didn't come out of a university.
Half of what we knew in IT today comes from either private tinkerers or from companies.
The transistor didn't come out of a university. The Haber-Bosch process didn't come out of a university. At least, that's a bit. That's a bit closer to a university. But and there are examples, many examples of things that are close to the university, and some examples of things from universities. One could argue the atomic bomb is the product of university research, at least the initial idea. Most certainly is. But of course, the development of the atomic bomb is not something done in a university. So yes, there is a systematic overestimation of the role of the university, and that's important because today it's assumed that in fact most radical innovations will come from universities, will be spun out, will be funded by venture capitalists, and who will then create new firms that will change the world.
Yeah, I think this is, in my opinion, maybe the core issue here, because you could say, okay, professors are arrogant and believe that they know the world. Okay, so this would be maybe one a problem of lack of intellectual humility, if you will. But the deeper problem is that as a society, we seem to believe that. And this also means that we make policies and funding decisions based on that idea, which I think are misguided to a certain extent.
I couldn't agree more. And all over the world, this very strange model of university-led innovation has become entrenched, at least in public discourse.
Yeah.
Obviously not in private discourse, because as it were, real innovators know what is actually going on. But I agree with you, it's very damaging. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of where innovation is in fact coming from. And more broadly, a misunderstanding of the kind of changes that we need in order to transform our world.
Which might also give an understanding to the rather provocative thing that Peter Thiel did, or does still, I don't know. He was quite heavily criticized for that because he funded stipendia. How do you call it, stipendia?
Stipends.
Stipends. So he funded stipends for people who would leave university to do something practical, like to fund a company. And people said, how can you ruin the people's life or the student's life? He said, no, they shouldn't waste their time at university, the good ones. They should do something. And might be a bit of a provocative take here on the
Yes, I mean, there's another problem, and that is the kind of cult of the entrepreneur. which has been so important in the public discourse in recent years, I think is a very misguided view of the economy, that entrepreneurs of that mythical sort are central. We've got to, of course, recognize that large firms remain hugely important. And we don't want to talk about them as large firms doing things, but they are important. They are the central engine of innovation still, and they have enormous power. So more generally than the case of technology, we have a curious inability to describe the kind of economy and society in realistic terms. I think the case of technology is kind of worse than that of the economy or society. We're much more sophisticated about economy and society than we are about technology. But the problem is not uniquely about technology.
There's another problem, in my opinion, associated with this type of, let me put it in my words, I would call it like the arrogance of the elites, if you will, in terms of where knowledge is in the society. Because there is another very important question, I believe, namely, who's responsible for what's happening in society? So, for instance, what technology decisions you take? Who is taking responsibility? Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, the idea to delegate this to elites is not a good one, because elites made so many massive mistakes in the past. Mm-hmm. And also, it begs the question: so why should they decide? And what makes them the elites to decide? Mm-hmm. So I think it is a much more natural assumption that a lot of knowledge about what happens in society and what society is doing is actually in society. So in my opinion, the democratic point of view is to say, I'm sorry, but society has to take responsibility. I sometimes express it even more in a more like a demand, if you will. I think if you want to live in a society, if you want to consume the fruits of a modern society, you also have the obligation to take responsibility for that. Mm-hmm. Do you think this goes too far?
Well, I think it's difficult to talk about these things in the abstract as if it was a matter of choice, because the reality is that technical change is in the hands of very particular elites. That's the reality. And we need to start from that reality. So we haven't delegated the issue of technical change to a particular elite. That elite has that power already. What would it take to involve the mass of the population in technical choice? I think it would involve very major changes in our economy, in power structures in society. It's not just a question of changing the policies of a government ministry. So I think when we talk about who should be in charge of technology, we need to have, as I say, a realistic understanding of who is currently in charge. And it's important to note that for most places in the world, people in charge of decisions about new techniques and innovation strategies are a long, long way away in other countries, in other places. We are not, as a country, in charge of technical change, or as a people, as a group, in charge of technical change. It's a province of very, very particular people with a lot of power.
But in the end, people have to accept it and people have to pay for it.
Yes and no. I think one very important.
If you don't buy an iPhone, it will not be a success.
Oh yes, in that case, yes. But we can buy a Samsung perhaps. But you're absolutely right that we are constrained. But one of the important things about innovation is that most innovations are rejected. We live in a world with lots and lots of innovation, yes. Lots and lots of invention, much more than we could possibly use. So we do have to reject. And when we go shopping, we are rejecting 10 kinds of.
Not sure, because you're buying much less than you could buy.
Well, yes, but also we are indeed, but we're also rejecting 10 kinds of washing powder, yes, as we choose the one that we take home. So when we're thinking about innovation and our attitude, that's the position we should take. We should feel free to reject. We have to reject most of it, but the rhetoric that surrounds innovation is that it's wrong to reject innovation. No, we should reject most of it, otherwise we'd be inundated with stuff. We are free to choose. Well, we may not be entirely free to choose, but we should think of ourselves as having choice. And if we don't have choice, we should make sure that we do in fact have choice. And to reject the right technology is the progressive thing to do.
That is, I think, a very interesting point you're making. So like, if it's progress or not is in the end a value judgment, in my opinion. Progress for you or not. And I totally agree. The idea that everything that is new, that is an innovation, also in digital. In the last 2 days, I had 3 examples. One friend of mine is in Italy right now, and she made the point, it's crazy, the place where we are, the hotels have no keys anymore. They have some weird electronic system that isn't working. So they had to spend hours in front of the hotel door to get in. The restaurants don't have menus anymore. You have to use your smartphone, and you cannot use cash anymore. And I just booked some trips recently, and I have to say, the idea that these booking platforms made our booking easier, I personally find it ridiculous. Yeah. Like, I think there was like a progress for some time, and over the last 10 years, in my opinion, it goes constantly down. To book a hotel for me now is like a day's enterprise. Yes. Because the price differences are so big depending on which platform, which time. I mean, unless you're willing to pay anything, okay. But if you want to take an informed decision, so I cannot see this as a progress, right?
Yes. There's a wonderful term coined by Cory Doctorow's "enshittification."
Yeah.
And yes, we see it everywhere. And artificial intelligence, will enshittify our world even more. I mean, it's.
Let me ask you this question, because I wanted to ask you this in the end anyway. So I started with a quotation from your book where you said like the digitization did not bring the, productivity gains or whatever that we might have expected. Now, obviously, the current hype tells us artificial intelligence will transform everything and revolutionize everything, and productivity will go through the roof. The first indicators don't look like that, in my opinion. But what is your assumption of what's going on here?
Well, I don't know, but I also know the people that are telling us it's going to revolutionize things don't know either, and this is the usual bullshit that we get. These are interested parties telling us to buy their product, and that's all it is. Now, I'm not saying that artificial intelligence isn't important. It is a powerful technique that will do certain things for sure. But whether it will have the effects that are claimed for it, I very, very, very much doubt. We've seen these claims before.
But let me reframe the question, because before we talked about stagnation, which I really thought we had, except for some areas in IT, but even there things went slower than we might have expected. Mm-hmm. But
artificial intelligence at some level is already here, of course. That's another point. It's not something that's going to happen and change everything.
True, but I'm talking mostly now about the large language models and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And the point...
in the case of universities, I think that artificial intelligence will have a paradoxical and a very good effect. And that is that it will take us back to older ways of examining students, to exams, handwritten exams, to perhaps oral exams, discussions, because we simply can't trust
that's true.
The work that is done on a computer. The other thing artificial intelligence does is it will show us actually that much of the so-called knowledge we produce is no better than produced by one of these AI models. So I think it'll lead us to reflect on the need for a greater quality in what we write and how we think about things. But that will not be achieved through AI, but through other processes that we're very familiar with.
But this brings a very interesting conundrum here. On the one hand, I totally agree that we shouldn't listen. Just recently there was a large article that quoted the CEO from NVIDIA, like one of the companies that makes most money with AI, and quoting what would change. These articles are bullshit, because this guy, of course, has his interest in mind. But let's forget about that. I'm observing the IT space since probably, meanwhile, 40 years. And I have to say the capability of large language model in language capability is absolutely astounding for me. Because I did not expect that would happen so fast. I'm just the pure linguistic quality. You get results that practically error-free linguistically. That is extraordinarily astounding to me. And I have not expected that. On the other hand, as far as knowledge goes, I'm deeply troubled because I think academia is deeply flawed in terms of quality. We have huge quality problems in all fields. Now, these systems swallow up everything. And how should they judge which is of higher, of lower quality. So now everything of that will be mingled into one model. And what's even worse is this is why the technologists already talk about the time, I think, before 2021 or something like that, or some such date and after. Because what's happening now is of course that a large and larger number of documents or artifacts is produced by large language models. So you see sort of a self-reflective loop. So now suddenly the systems learn from the output they produce. Where will this lead?
Exactly, disaster. I agree with you that some of these models are extraordinarily powerful. And one simple example would be translation.
Yes.
I mean, the capacity to translate a very long text almost instantaneously to very high quality standards, it's just extraordinary, and it's there. And that is revolutionary, I think. But I very much agree with you. Imagine if you'd asked AI or ChatGPT the questions you've asked me. My answers were not very good, but I can guarantee you that the answers from ChatGPT would be absolutely hopeless and useless. Yeah. Going back to an earlier point I made, if one is just going to survey what is out there in the internet on the questions that we've been talking about, technology and society, technology and humanity, and all these sort of things, it's mostly rubbish.
Yes. Systematically
rubbish.
Indeed.
And AI will turn it into more rubbish, and once you put the AI-generated rubbish into
nicer written rubbish
into the input, you get even more rubbish. So it's most definitely not a panacea. Actually, it would, if applied to our sort of discussion, lead to further enshittification of our knowledge.
Maybe as a last question, then, how are you optimistic or pessimistic in the sense of will this enshittification? I mean, the enshittification probably has to come to an end at one point in time. So, will we humans in the end be able to take control again over like what we like, how we want to live and so on? Or is it rather likely that we simply will be forced into some processes or guardrails that are essentially defined by what's easy for technology? You know what I mean?
Humans are in control already. The question is, which human? Who is in control?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Enshittification is not a product of technology. It's a product of particular decisions, particular corporate interests. So we mustn't blame the technology. Mm-hmm. We mustn't use the term technology because it stops us thinking.
That is an extraordinary good word to the end, so to speak. Thank you very much for the conversation.
It's been a pleasure.